and discharged the taser before turning back around and continuing to run. You then see him fall to the ground. Here's the moment Brooks appears to discharge the taser and the officer fires. Here it is once more in slow motion. Brooks was shot, taken to the hospital where he died, the GBI said. Attorneys representing Brooks' family spoke out last night.
Why not talk to him as a human being and say, hey, buddy, maybe you had too much to drink. Leave your car here, take Uber. I've seen it happen before, but that didn't happen. Instead, they got physical. He ran. He did have the taser, but according to law, a taser is not a lethal weapon. So he didn't have a lethal weapon in his hand. He was running with the taser, and then they shot him. It's just, it didn't need to happen.
Garrett Rolfe, the police officer who shot and killed Brooks, has been terminated, Atlanta police spokesman Carlos Campos tells CNN. The second police officer, Devin Brosnan, has been placed on administrative duty, and the police chief is stepping down.
We need to change the culture of policing. We need to evaluate how we train police. We need to make sure police not only support the communities that they have a duty to protect and serve, but in many cases they need to be in the community that they have a duty to protect and serve.
A cousin of Brooks spoke yesterday.
I didn't think you're going to hit right here, man. I thought this city was better than that. They got to answer. Somebody need to say something. Somebody need to at least let the family know something. We need to at least know that the city is with us.
Now, the death of Rayshard Brooks, think about this. It's just coming during weeks of demonstrations across the country over the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd.
Polo Sandoval has been covering the protests. Polo, good morning to you.
Hey guys, good morning. As we wait for that video to be released, let me take you across the country and just give you a snapshot of what we've seen the last 24 hours in terms of that call for reform, that call for change. In New Orleans, demonstrators certainly making a very strong statement here. In this case, as they took to a local park there in New Orleans and eventually ended up throwing a statue of a mid-19th century slave owner into the Mississippi River. Authorities saying the protesters damaged the monument to John McDonough during the afternoon and then loaded up onto a truck, drove it to the banks of the river, and then threw it in. New Orleans police saying that they have apprehended the drivers of that truck, but not commenting further. I also want to take you to Washington, D.C. and New York. Very similar scenes playing out in both those major cities. In the nation's capital, a protest making its way from Lafayette Park, which was the scene of some very tense situation a couple of weeks ago, but yesterday really quite peaceful as these demonstrators making a symbolic move to take a knee, showing their solidarity with the family of George Floyd. Also a very similar scene that took place in Brooklyn at Barclays Center as well. And then finally in Washington, that demonstration did continue through the weekend here with that in Seattle, where demonstrators have been refusing to leave the city's Capitol Hill neighborhood. The occupation prompting the police department to even close down or board up a local police department or local police precinct. But authorities there saying that they do hope to eventually reopen and resume operations. So what do all of these have in common, Victor and Christy? That call for change, that call for reform. Yesterday, the governor here in New York saying he will be giving municipalities in New York State until the 1st of April of 2021 to not only reassess, but also institute these changes that so many people are calling for this morning.
I do not believe that this was a justified use of deadly force and have called for the immediate termination of the officer. What has become abundantly clear over the last couple of weeks in Atlanta is that while we have a police force full of men and women who work alongside our communities with honor, respect, and dignity, there has been a disconnect with what our expectations are and should be as it relates to interactions with our officers and the communities in which they are entrusted to protect. Chief Erica Shields has been a solid member of APD for over 2 decades and has a deep and abiding love for the people of Atlanta. And because of her desire that Atlanta be a model of what meaningful reform should look like across this country, Chief Shields has offered to immediately step aside as police chief so that the city may move forward with urgency in rebuilding the trust so desperately needed throughout our communities. Former Assistant Police Chief and now Interim Corrections Chief Rodney Bryant will serve as the Interim Police Chief as we immediately launch a national search for new leadership. Chief Shields will continue in a role to be determined. To the men and women of APD, your service and sacrifice on behalf of our communities is not lost upon me, and I remain grateful for the work that you do to keep our city safe. But as Dr. King reminded us many years ago, there is a fierce urgency of now that calls upon each of us, myself included, to be held accountable to the communities in which we are entrusted to serve. For that reason, we have already convened an advisory committee to examine our use of force policies in our city and expect feedback within the next 2 weeks with final recommendations within the next 45 days.
Very awful situation has unfolded in Atlanta. You're looking at live pictures coming in from that Wendy's over there where the incident occurred last night. Look at that building. It's now totally engulfed in flames. That's where Rayshard Brooks, he was in his car, simply going through the drive-thru. He fell asleep. Our cars were going around him. The police showed up, and then that situation deteriorated big time, resulting in Rayshard Brooks, 27 years old, being shot and killed by police. And there are a lot of angry folks in Atlanta. They blocked off Interstate 75, a major interstate in the Atlanta area. Firefighters can't even get to the Wendy's and other places in the area to deal with that fire. So that fire continues right now with no firefighters on the scene. Ariva Martin is still with us, our legal analyst. She's a civil rights attorney at the same time. Ariva, as you see the situation, it was a very peaceful demonstration, but then things quickly deteriorated.
Yeah, we've seen that happen with really throughout the country as we've watched these protests erupt following the brutal murder of George Floyd. And I think we minimize the pain of the protesters when we only focus on the fires or the looting, because I don't think we can even understand the pain that the African American community and communities really all over the world are feeling as we watch these deaths play out. When being killed by the police is the 6th leading cause of death for black men, we are way beyond policy changes. We're way beyond body cams or policies as it relates to tasers. We have to have that incredibly uncomfortable conversation in this country that focuses on systemic racism. And we get really close often to having that conversation. We teeter around the edges of it, but then we retreat from it. But until we have that conversation, we can enact policies at the local level, we can enact policies at the federal level, but they're not going to be carried out in any way that respects the dignity and humanity of African American men. And we keep seeing that over and over again. We have been at this point on so many occasions. Walter Scott, as Chris Stewart talked about, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin. We can do a roll call of all of the African American men that have been killed by police and what happens in the aftermath. There's intense media scrutiny of the death. There's a protest, there's call for change, and then we go back, we retreat back into that place that's safe without pushing through and having this conversation about systemic racism and how it permeates police departments around this country. And we have to have that conversation at this moment, or we'll be right back here, not in 5 years, as Chris suggested, but we'll be back probably next week and definitely next month.
I'm meteorologist Tyler Malden for CNN. What do you say we take a look at your forecast for today and what's coming down the pike for next week? Starting out west across the Four Corners, where we have had an elevated fire risk over the last couple of days. We are going to continue to see that today and on into early next week. We have roughly 5 million people in this part of the country under a red flag warning or a fire weather watch. Meanwhile, in southern Oregon and northeast Nevada, we have frost advisories. That doesn't make sense. That's not supposed to happen. It's June. We're supposed to be feeling the heat. Oh, Phoenix, you have been feeling some oppressive heat. We're 2 weeks into the month of June, and you have had a string of 105-degree weather days. In fact, out of the 13 days that we've seen thus far, you've had 9 days of temperatures above 105, and you know what? We're going to add to that next week. The Pacific Northwest, we have a rainmaker coming ashore. Could give us even some wintry precip late tonight in portions of Idaho, the higher elevations of Idaho, and a lot of rainfall for Seattle, Washington, down to Portland, Oregon, where you're already seeing a surplus of rainfall for this month. The Southeast, flash flood threat. This stalled frontal boundary and accompanying low pressure system, that has given us some rainfall this weekend. We're going to add to that today and next week. South Florida, you could pick up roughly 5 inches of rainfall. We saw some flooding in the southwest Florida region. Naples, you saw some flooding on Saturday. That's possible again as we go into later on this afternoon and next week. But look at North Carolina and South Carolina. Holy cow, the oranges and the reds, that indicates about 6, 7, maybe even more than that inches of rain. Like, that's a lot of rain, guys. So do play safe. Remember, if you run across flooded area, turn around, don't drown. Big heat on the way. This is going to come from the southwest. It's going to push to the east. Atlanta, you have not seen a 90-degree day thus far this June. That's going to change by the time we get to the end of next week. I'm Ty, the weather guy for CNN.
Well, hi, Anna. We are in the heart of the occupation area, or the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, as protesters have called it. Let's show you what things look like. It has this sort of street festival vibe. You can see all these folks here on the street, and that is the police station that has effectively been taken over by the protesters. You can maybe see the graffiti there on the sign where it says the Seattle People Department, and this has been going on since Monday. As you know, you had violent clashes taking place in Seattle between some of the protesters and police. Tear gas was deployed. It was a really ugly situation. And the city made the calculated decision that they were going to try to de-escalate the situation, so they left, and that created a vacuum, and that vacuum was filled with protesters. The mayor seems to be in no hurry to want to get this situation to end. She is saying that this is an expression of democracy, and she's advanced no plans in terms of how or when this occupation might end. In the meantime, I want you to hear from one protester we spoke with who is responding to some of the fiery rhetoric from President Trump, and you're also going to hear from a police officer who has acknowledged that the department has made some mistakes. Take a look.
I'm not scared of Donald Trump, no, and I'm not scared of his police officers either. We're going to stay outside this building whether they come here or not. We're going to take this building over whether they're outside threatening us or not. We brought the fight to them on their front lines and pushed their line back. We're not afraid of them.
We want a dialogue. We want to communicate, right? But if the public is so angry at us, how do we start them? How do we do better? People expect better. We need to be better.
Now, Anna, in terms of what these protesters want, there is a whole laundry list of demands, but among the primary things, this will sound familiar, they want to see the police department defunded, but they also want to see this police precinct turned into a community center. Now, one of the problems that has arisen as a result of protesters filling this area and the officers leaving that precinct is that, according to the chief of the department, it has increased the response time triple. So, in other words, what used to take 5 minutes to respond to a situation or a police call in this area is now taking 15 minutes. So that is worrisome, and that's why the chief wants to see this situation come to an end as quickly as possible. Anna?
Like presidents before him, President Trump delivered the commencement to this year's graduates of the West Point Military Academy. But a few other striking differences. Take a look. Each second lieutenant is celebrating their graduation. At 6 feet apart due to the coronavirus pandemic. The president's speech coming at a time when the nation is undergoing racial unrest, a pandemic, and tensions between the White House and the U.S. military. CNN White House correspondent Jeremy Diamond attended today's ceremonies and is joining us now from West Point. So, Jeremy, the president spoke for almost 30 minutes today. How did he keep it relevant and current?
Well, it was a fairly staid address from the president. You know, he really did stick to the remarks that were in the teleprompter for him. We did hear the president, though, acknowledge, at least in passing, this notion of turbulent times that this country is currently going through. We heard the president thank the National Guard in particular, both for its role in handling the coronavirus pandemic, but also in terms of its role, as he has seen it, in terms of the unrest that we have seen in several cities in America and the deployment of some of those National Guardsmen. It was interesting, though, as we heard the president talk about the turbulent times, for him to fall back on the notion of the importance of institutions in this moment, particularly because what we have seen from the president in recent weeks is what many view as him politicizing the military. The president has come under withering criticism, both from some current military officials as well as those past military and defense officials like the Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, who criticized the president for deploying National Guardsmen to handle the unrest in Lafayette Park just over a week ago. The president, though, insisting that institutions will stand the test of time. So a very interesting message from the president there, particularly in the face of some of the criticism that he has faced. We did not, however, hear the president address in a more comprehensive manner than we have in the past this national reckoning on racism that this country is currently facing. The president so far has really avoided delving too deeply into that issue, and that certainly was not what his focus was on today during his remarks at West Point.
Breaking news, this is coming to us from Texas. At least 8 people have been shot here in an incident in San Antonio. This happened last night outside of 2 bars. This is what we know from police. A group was denied entry into one of the bars. A man then walked to his car, we're told, and then pulled out a rifle and started shooting. Police also say that the man said that he was a UFC fighter from California, no name released, and we know that police are still looking for that shooter. They say, though, that there is no threat currently to that area.
I'm Ty the Other guy for CNN. Over the last couple of days, you've heard us talk about that elevated fire risk across the Southwest. Unfortunately, you're going to hear us talk about that for the rest of this weekend and as we go into next week too. Now, we've had a lot of wildfires across the region. In Arizona, you specifically, you currently have 10 wildfires that aren't contained. Those are 10 active wildfires. One of those, the Bighorn Fire, right outside of Tucson, nearly 9,000 acres scorched and only 10% contained. We're going to see a critical fire risk for the regions shaded in red today and tomorrow. That's because we have the excessive heat, the strong winds, and yeah, those dry conditions too. So be smart if you're heading outside. Take a look at your screen real quick. I have some tips here for you. Some things that you want to avoid doing this weekend if you live in that region, because these items right here, these activities could easily cause a spark, which could cause a fire. And that's why we have that high fire risk for this region. Now, more than 6 million people are under a red flag warning right now, and roughly 1.5 million people are under a fire weather watch as well. One of those main ingredients causing this is the drought. And as you can see, we have a severe to extreme drought across much of the Southwest, the Great Basin, and going into the West Coast. Forecast radar shows some decent rainfalls up there towards the Pacific Northwest, but not much across the Southwest. Unfortunately, the Four Corners, you may pick up half an inch for the next 5 days. So that's not going to help anything. That's not going to help that drought, nor are these winds that we're going to see this weekend. We could see wind gusts all the way up to 50 miles per hour, if not a little stronger in some spots. In addition, we are going to see a bubble of heat come up through the Southwest on into the plains, and that is some real big league heat next week. Tucson, your average high, get this, 100 degrees. We'll be at 105 on Saturday, and then we hover around 100 degrees for the rest of the week. That's certainly not going to help the fires. I'm Ty, the weather guy for CNN.
Reopening now on pause in Oregon and Utah's Mount.
As long as we give the virus an opportunity to jump from one host to another, that's what it's going to do.
The governor of Texas looking to July 4th for a full reopening of his state as Harris County, which includes Houston, records some of its highest numbers to date for new cases and hospitalizations.
We've got to take action now so that we avoid a shutdown in the future.
Houston's Energy Stadium being prepped as a field hospital just in case. 19 states are trending up in the past week. Texas, Florida, and South Carolina posting single-day records as the CDC predicts 130,000 virus-related deaths by July 4th.
We're in the early days of the pandemic, and if only 5 or 10% of the population has had this infection, we have a really long way to go.
The agency recommending the best way to stay safe, keep your distance, avoid travel, and wear a mask.
I know it's become politicized. Put that aside. The virus knows no politics.
Face coverings required in LA County, which moved into phase 3 today after recording its highest single-day increase this week. Gyms, day camps, and TV and film production among the businesses reopening. Missouri will fully reopen next week. Concerts and conventions can resume in Georgia July 1st. Meantime, anyone attending the president's campaign rally next week in Tulsa must sign a waiver promising not to sue if they contract the virus.
We know that the types of conditions that lead to the highest rate of COVID-19 transmission are crowded indoor spaces with a lot of people who are shouting and screaming. I think it's almost certain that we will see super spreader events come from these rallies.
In terms of those rallies, the CDC did put out these guidelines again on Friday, and they were asked how to call about their guidelines for high-risk large gatherings, which include ones where you can't socially distance, where people may come from out of state, whether there was specific guidance for political rallies. And reporters were told on the call that this is guidance for all large gatherings, basically anything, Aaron, bigger than a backyard barbecue.
Another important story that I want to ask you about tonight, the Trump administration announcing that it is eliminating an Obama-era regulation prohibiting discrimination in healthcare against transgender patients. What kind of effect will that have on the transgender community when they try to seek medical care?
This is really heartbreaking. I mean, these are basic protections put in place by the ACA under the Obama administration to prevent discrimination. And things like, denying insurance coverage for basic care. Already, 70% of people who are transgender, and this is 1.5 million people in the United States, it's not a small number, they already experience discrimination, and now we're taking away the most basic protections at a time when it's been very challenging to receive care because of coronavirus. People have had to delay gender-affirming surgeries. They've had to have disruptions in their hormonal treatments. This has been a really rough time for this group of vulnerable patients, and now this, just a heartbreaking story today, and I'm really scared about the quality of care that transgender individuals will receive.
You've advised that people who are planning to attend President Trump's big rally next week in Oklahoma, that any large group, in your words, is a danger and risky. Have you told President Trump himself that this rally and other huge gatherings like this potentially could be very dangerous and risky?
I have not specifically spoken to him about that, but the principles that I have been espousing hold true and stand, as I've said them before. When you're in a large crowd, if you have the congregation of people that are much, much close to each other, you definitely increase the risk that you will either acquire or spread infections. And I've said there are some people that are going to do that anyway, no matter what I say. But the issue is, if they do, please wear a mask all the time, because a mask will give you some protection. The best thing to do is to avoid crowded areas. But if you're not going to do that, please wear a mask.
Dan, I've got to get this in, and I want you to respond because during this segment, the president just tweeted this. He said, we had previously scheduled our MAGA rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma for June 19th, a big deal. Unfortunately, however, this would fall on the Juneteenth holiday. Many of my African-American friends and supporters have reached out to suggest that we consider changing the date out of respect for this holiday. And in observance of this important occasion and all that it represents, I have therefore decided to move our rally on Saturday, June 20th, in order to honor their request. We have already had ticket requests in excess, of course, of more than 200,000 people. I look forward to seeing everyone in Oklahoma. Dan, what do you think?
Well, he's yielded some to the pressure. The pressure against what he was planning to do, the irony, the outrage on that date. But he hasn't yielded much. And it indicates that, once again, he is doubling down on his re-election strategy of divide, keep the country divided along racial lines, and try to adhere to Steve Bannon's old advice. You remember Steve Bannon in 2016 told candidate Trump, as long as we can keep them, which is to say the country's talking about race, we win. What this announcement, which is a minor adjustment by him, says he's doubling down on that bet.
So we're going to check my temperature first.
This is how students at Harvard Elementary School in Houston and likely other schools across the country will be greeted when doors eventually reopen.
97.7.
Mandatory temperature checks. Next, they follow a carefully marked path to the PPE station, where each student is given their own face mask that must be worn throughout the day. Interim Houston Superintendent Granita Lathan, who oversees the largest school district in Texas with about 210,000 students, has quite literally weathered many past storms.
I want to remind people we're still recovering from 2017 when Hurricane Harvey hit. And now we're being hit by COVID-19.
But safely reopening schools in the middle of a pandemic is no doubt her biggest challenge yet.
This virus has stumped me, I will tell you the truth.
She gave CNN a first-hand look at just how daunting that challenge is by walking us through the city's oldest school to show us how educators, together with health officials, are preparing guidelines for what students and teachers can expect to see when they return.
So this is one of our classrooms.
Classrooms will be significantly smaller, with 2 or even 1 student per table.
As we think about 11 students in a classroom at a time.
Cafeterias will be less crowded, with some meals served in classrooms instead. Those familiar tables meant to seat a large group will now be used by just a few students at a time.
Initially, I believe it's going to be a prepackaged lunch.
Hallway traffic will be regulated, and instead of students out together when that bell rings, it will be teachers transitioning from class to class. And then there's the question about recess.
Recess will look differently, and the way it will look is we will have a reduced number of students out on the playground. We'll need to make sure that we're cleaning all of our playground equipment throughout the day.
It's a blueprint being modeled in large school districts, including for the 2 million students in Los Angeles. The LA County Office of Education released its guidelines that include staggered days, one-way hallways, and solo play. It's not just schools that are being refitted. Approximately 480,000 school buses transport more than 25 million students to and from school each day across the country. This is how social distancing will look for many of those passengers.
As you can see, we've labeled our seats so where we would space students out.
All of this change comes with a hefty price tag.
Reconfiguring schools, reconfiguring school buses, all of this costs a lot of money. How does this play out in the end?
A little bit of federal money is starting to come down to take care of at least some of those initial costs. But on the horizon is costs that are much, much larger.
Most experts envision the school year beginning with a hybrid of both online and in-person classes. The priority, they say, is opening their doors for the most vulnerable.
We're most worried about students who are economically disadvantaged, students who are English language learners, students with disabilities, students who don't have internet at home.
We're seeing this backdrop of that playground, and I'm sure children will be seeing that and say, I want to go back to school. I want to see my friends. What is your message to those kids and their families?
To be patient, allow us an opportunity to finalize our plan to ensure that students can be on the playground, they can be in the classroom, in our cafeteria, on our buses, but just to be patient with us.
They're what we decide to honor.
Every monument would like to be timeless.
It's not a neutral thing. It's loaded with emotion.
The destruction of a monument, I would say, enlivens it again. They're born, they live, and then they die, and they're replaced, by other monuments, by new ideas.
So we have both emotions at the beginning and emotions when there is a desire to challenge the reason why these monuments are there. The removal of old monuments is a sort of cleansing experience. It's very much a shutting of a particular period out, ending it, and starting of something new.
So a new generation comes of age and is able to push for justice, for accountability for those crimes, for the removal of many of these monuments. Sometimes taking down a monument is a symbolic form of reparation to a group that has been marginalized by the story that is told by that monument.
I think they operate as a statement of politics, statement of emotions, and that point at which a decision is made, we are commemorating something. So it's not so much that it's the statue, it is the moment that they want to memorize. At that moment, there seems to have been a need to erect them.
Without the emotions that somebody brings to a memorial, the memorial itself is really blank, a blank face, a blank slate. Every monument would like to be timeless. Every regime would like to be as timeless as they wish their monuments were. But these monuments are built in a very particular time.
You have to understand, in a place like Spain when I was born, under a military dictatorship, all of the street names, monuments, emblems were a constant reminder of the victory of Franco's forces. Not having monuments that reflect your version of that story is one way in which your community is being broken up.
So when communism fell, first thing that you could see neglected or challenged or removed were actually these monuments to the Red Army, the monuments that was supposed to signify the gratitude of the Polish nation.
When that love and affection wanes, the monument loses its affect, loses its power. And this can happen almost overnight.